Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week, we set the stage for this mini-series on the impact the recent discoveries of our ancient hominid cousins and ancestors might have on Christian theology. We gave the listeners an analogy, or allegory, the story of a teenage girl who had grown up thinking she was an only child, until she started exploring in the attic and found a photo album that told a very different story. That she had an older brother who disappeared before she was old enough to form lasting memories of him. And the questions that those photos unleashed in her brain, not to mention the whirlwind of emotions that followed. And just like the flood of questions that suddenly filled the head of that teenage girl in the attic, when people insist that there was a first human, a primal pair, Adam and Eve, and they build a whole theology around that primal pair, a lot of questions are inevitably raised when they start finding out there were, in fact, people who preceded Adam and Eve. And we can get a sense of the discussion, the debates that will come out of this because it's happened before. There was another period in time when the Christian church found out that there were people before Adam and Eve, pre-Adamites, and they didn't respond well to that revelation at that time. That's the topic for today's episode, to get us ready to tackle next week's episode when we look at the huge theological implications of our recent discoveries of Neanderthals and Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo naledi, and the big-brained Homo julioensis.
Do they purposely sit, like you scientists, do you sit around a table and think, what name can we come up with that absolutely nobody on the planet can pronounce?
Well, Scott, you're big on fish at aquariums, and you would know some of the Latin names, the
Sure.
Scientific names for some of the fish, and they're named after the fish, right? They might,
Yeah.
like I'm sure there's a Latin word for swordtails, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what they do. Now, you look at these names, Homo erectus. Well, Homo is a family of organisms that are all very similar, and Homo erectus was the one who stood up erect.
Yeah.
Homo habilis was the handyman. Habilis is Latin for handy.
Okay.
Naledi was Homo found in the Naledi caves.
Right, okay.
Neanderthals are also named after where they were discovered. So is Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelberg,
Okay, yes.
That's where they were found.
Yeah.
So that was a long-winded answer to your question, Scott. They're just saying this is the human who was left-handed, so they'll name it Homo sinistra.
Yeah, okay. I get that. Nomenclature in the science it's not really, in a certain ways, very scientific. Like what you just described, like some of them are named after where they were found. Some of them are named after even the discoverer sometimes, right? Or it's just kind of interesting. Like in other areas, like in biology, like in medicine, for example, they'll call something a certain, I'm trying to think of a medical term, but like, what's the medical term for swelling?
Edema?
Edema, yeah. And you'll find other words related to it, but they'll be, you can tell that, that's probably something to do with swelling because of edema something, or, you know what I mean? Like there's a sense to the thing. I find in the biological sciences, it's not so much that. It's more of a bit of a hodgepodge.
Well, and they like to have fun because now I can't come up with accurate examples, but some start naming things after video games that they play or a novel that they read that they loved.
Yeah.
They'll name it after their girlfriend in some cases, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But we're here to talk about this whole idea of where did humans come from? Mm-hmm. Our guest today is Dr. David Livingstone, who wrote a book specifically about that period in the 17th century when the church was wrestling with the new concept of the pre-Adamites. The title is Adam's Ancestors, Race, Religion, and Politics of Human Origins. So clearly it's hugely relevant to this mini-series of episodes we're doing on the theological questions that are raised by those recent discoveries of our hominid ancestors. Dr. Livingstone is Professor of Geography and Intellectual History at Queen's University in Belfast. His research work focuses on questions of historical geography as it pertains to science and religion. He's got a long list of books published and academic awards. He's been a fellow in a dozen different professional societies and has given prestigious lectures all over the world. And we have him here today in our virtual studio. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Where are you coming from, David? What part of Britain?
I'm from Northern Ireland in Belfast, a place that I'm glad to say used to be in the news much more than it is now for all sorts of reasons. So, yeah, I'm sitting in East Belfast and it's a sunny day, unusually for Ireland. So, yeah, it's good.
Yeah, welcome, David. I recently have been reading your book, and it's fascinating and a very different way of looking at the pre-Adamite issue than I've come across before. So, really appreciate that.
Good. Well, thanks for the welcome. Great to be here and nice to get a chance to talk about a book that I brought out, I don't know, goodness me, I suppose it's almost 20 years ago now. So it's strange how fast time goes by. So there you go.
Yeah.
But it needs to be said it's about a subject that goes back centuries before that, David. So it's still new and hot off the press.
It's a long history from that point of view, I can tell you.
Yes.
Yeah.
David, you've carved out an incredibly unique niche in which to do your research. I'm going to say it again, historical geography as it pertains to science and religion. There can't be more than a handful of scholars in that area. So what drew you into that?
Well, I initially began writing a dissertation on the history of the geological sciences in America. And I was focusing on one particular geologist who taught at Harvard towards the tail end of the 19th century. But when I was doing that work, it became really clear to me that you couldn't really work in isolation from a whole range of other things beyond the earth sciences. Everything from religion to poetry to history to literature and so on. And the field just sort of got bigger and bigger. And then, of course, the geography of this became important because how things developed in one place seemed to me to be quite different from how it developed in, say, another place. So, I mean, another book that I did some years ago looked at how Christian communities who shared the same theological outlook, belonged to the same confessional tradition, how did they respond to the challenges of Darwinian biology? And of course, you would think, they all coming from the same confessional tradition, therefore they must all respond the same way. And guess what? That turned out not to be the case at all. So the particulars, for example, of the American South, they couldn't think of Darwin without thinking about questions about race and slavery.
Yeah.
Whenever you were thinking about it in Britain or in Ireland in particular, you couldn't think about this outside the context of who was going to control education. Was it going to be these new secularists? Or was it going to be the traditional church and so on? And so there are some places where people from this roughly Presbyterian tradition embraced many aspects of the theory of evolution and other places where it was vigorously opposed. And that's how the history and the geography came together in my thinking about the relations between science and religion. In other words, not just an abstracted theological and scientific encounter, but encounters in specific places at specific points in time, thinking about the politics, the cultural circumstances, all of that. So I think, look, that's what drew me into this. And then since that thesis, I've sort of limped along in a career, hanging on by my fingertips. To trying to say something on these sorts of lines. So that's how I got to be here.
I had to respond because you've been doing very great work. I've watched many of your presentations. I saw you speak actually at ASA back in, I think it was 2021, right in the middle of the whole COVID thing.
That's right. I remember I did that through Zoom, just as we're doing today. So my commiserations. Look, you could pick better speakers, I have to tell you.
Not at all. Not at all.
In my own experience, when I first came to a more evangelical faith, I came out of a very liberal background. But I remember one of the very first questions that I had and things that bothered me was this whole issue of pre-hominids. And, the biblical account doesn't seem to account for that. And the worldview that I was exposed to initially certainly didn't. And so, yeah, that was one of the first kind of challenging things that started me thinking, questioning, I guess, my newfound beliefs.
Well, can I just chip into that for a minute, Scott, too? Because one of the things that I think drew me to thinking about these issues historically was that I think many people in faith traditions don't really know the history of their own traditions.
Yes.
And when I began to read back into some of the 19th and early 20th century figures, I mean, giants, I suppose you might say, in the history of certain branches of conservative theological opinion, I was surprised initially to find that they were quite open to recent scientific advances. They were supportive of evolutionary theories. Now, they read them, of course, through the lens of their theology, but this was nothing like the warfare that I had thought that I would find. And so I think it became useful sometimes when dealing with these questions in a church context is you can take the heat out of it by looking historically at how different people responded, and then you can use that as a bridge to talking about these issues more generally.
Yeah, I totally concur with that. And I remember for me how delighted I was, in a sense, when I discovered Warfield was quite open and friendly toward evolution. I thought, well, here's one of the stalwarts of conservative Princetonian theology, and he's open to the idea of evolution. Yeah, we had an episode on the warfare metaphor and how inadequate that really is. And unfortunately, it still persists. I mean, you hear people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and people like this, popularizers out there, and they still conjure up as if we're back in the 16th century almost, and that wasn't even the way that many have portrayed it, so yeah.
Well, can I just add onto that? Look, we're maybe getting off the topic already, but you mentioned Warfield here. Now, see, one thing that I discovered about Warfield, who was a key figure, for me thinking about these things as well, was, of course, that he came from a stock breeding family in Kentucky. So they were used to breeding shorthorn cattle. And what very few people know is that or realizes that before Warfield became a theologian, between university and seminary, he acted as an editor for a livestock breeding journal. Now, believe it or not, his father had already written a couple of books on breeding shorthorn cattle. And when you go back to those books, which I did, there's a lot of quoting of, guess who? Charles Darwin on domesticated animals. So in one sense, I think Warfield encountered questions about breeding and mutation and so on. He encountered it in the feedlot before he encountered it theologically.
Yeah, right. And the good thing in favor of Warfield, whether you agree or disagree with him in different areas, but the point being that he didn't decide that he had to then combat it. He had,
exactly.
It was more of an accommodation. Okay, that's what the science is telling us. So then how do we have to think about that? As opposed to, the later on when it became such a combative thing, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly.
So, before we say too much more about how did the church respond to this whole issue, let's take a few steps back, quite a few steps actually. Before the Bible was written, before people started unpacking what was written in the Bible, let's go back to ancient history. And David, in your book, you give a brief sketch of how the ancient world understood anthropology, human origins. And I'm sure every people group had their own version of the origins of the first people, but it's especially important to talk about what the Greeks and Romans thought, because they controlled the known world at that time for centuries, just before Christianity came on the scene. And those Greeks and Romans laid down the foundation for so much science and philosophy that influenced thinking for millennia afterwards. So, David, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what the Greeks and Romans thought about human origins?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say here is that the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, and so on, presented an account of how human beings came to be on the earth, how they came to have inclinations to destroy other people, destroy the earth, so forth and so on. But generally, I think that a creation narrative of that sort was very common. There might be some differences. Babylonians had a creation story and a whole range of these. By the time that you get to the Romans, though, that story begins to be questioned by the belief that there were what came to be called monstrous races. And those monstrous races particularly came up in the writings of Pliny. And Pliny began to develop these ideas that there were, for example, people with human bodies and dog-like heads, cynocephaly, I think they were called, or cyclops, just one eye in the centers of their head, or with a massive great foot that was up to protect them from the sun, and so on. Now, this raised, in a very early sense, the question, particularly as Rome became progressively Christianized, were these people the descendants of Adam, or could they be the descendants of some other point of origin, or some other way of arriving upon the scene of time? And so, whilst that initial story of all human beings being descended from a single source, a monogenetic account, if you want to call it that, questions then began to be raised about where did these other people come from. Now, of course, much of this was myth, but in an important sense, it began to anticipate later those voyages which would encounter people in the southern hemisphere with different colors of skin, eventually in the 15th century encountering them across the Atlantic and so on. So this persistent question, where did they come from, and were these truly human beings at all, was something I think that's been very deep right back to the Roman period.
Can we spend a few more minutes on those Plinians, those strange people that were described by Pliny? You mentioned just a second ago, David, that most of that was myth. But I'm curious, at that time, those Romans, I mean, Pliny was a Roman, and he described these people. He wasn't just creating a story tale book for children to read. To what extent was this their speculation about the actual truth, about actual anthropology? Were these Plinians real in the minds of those Romans? Before we get into how the church responded to that.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is that it's both at once. Tales would come back from travels of one sort and another, maybe not even recorded for posterity, but tales would come back that some strange people had been encountered, and no doubt people different from what Romans looked like would have been encountered. I'm sure then that they were, let's just say, elaborated upon and speculated upon, and then multiplying out into these other types from around the world. And then you began to get kind of illustrations, woodcuts of these in the Nuremberg Chronicles later on, as a matter of fact, where many of these supposed creatures would find themselves. And also some of these creatures would be depicted. And I think the images are largely speculative, but there might still have been some kind of empirical reality beneath them. They would be inscribed on maps of one sort and another, so that you'd get, especially in distant places away from the center of the earth, which probably would have been Jerusalem or somewhere like that, you would get these images of these so-called monstrous races inhabiting various hitherto undiscovered or unexplored parts of the then known world.
It reminds me a little bit of our obsession, our modern obsession with aliens and UFOs. The unknown is feared. It tends to be feared, right? And the unknown for these ancient peoples was what's across that vast ocean, right? And you had sea monsters, right? They speculated, these great sea monsters, and I mean, the even biblically, the ocean is seen as a place of chaos and disorder and unknown and so on. So it doesn't seem to me a huge leap to think that that mindset would also speculate that there were other human type people in the that just makes sense to me that would be the case. And even the Bible has the Nephilim, that strange story,
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems pretty baked in.
Yeah, I think it is. And, it doesn't disappear with the ancient world. I mean, right up to, for example, maps in the 19th century. And I think it was a famous quote from Jonathan Swift, where someone put in the map something about map makers didn't know what to put in these empty spaces, so they put elephants there, even though there were no towns or something of that sort. Fill in the map, even though you have really no idea what's going to be there. You project these ideas onto it.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Jonathan Swift. I'm kind of glad you did, because I was going to ask a question, and I thought I wasn't sure if I should ask that, if it was a stupid question, but I read Gulliver's Travels only just a couple of years ago, and I was quite shocked at how he's encountering all these different kind of humanoid horse people and all these Is there a connection there? Is he feeding off something similar?
Well, I think that he's using those as metaphor tales about the horrors of the British Constitution.
Yeah, well, that's
things,
true. Yeah.
things of that sort. But I mean, his phrase was, "So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er unhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns." I think that's exactly what he wrote, and that's what went on their maps.
Oh,
So
that's
look, I
awesome.
think that's what roughly the kind of terrain. But I mean, there's a whole thing open for someone to go and do some further research on the details of all of this trekking through ancient documents. But I think it's a combination of a certain amount of empirical knowledge, and then, as Scott was saying, imagination takes over and fearfulness takes over, and then you create these beings that turn out not to have any existence really at all. So,
and before we move on, I'll just mention very quickly that on page 16 in your book, you mentioned Columbus had a copy of Pliny's book, and Columbus felt it a duty to report whether he found or didn't find these Plinians on distant lands.
Exactly. And that's a very, very important issue for the time when you get to the 15th century, because to the extent that there already was a kind of taxonomy of this range of human-like creatures, then the question became, where do people in the Americas, First Nations, where do they fit into this scheme? Where did they come from? Could they have traversed the Atlantic before Columbus did? Could there have been a land bridge? Where do they fit into this scheme of things? And then, of course, crucially, are they human at all? Just as you would have said this about the cynocephali, then you might have said this for Native Americans. You might have said this for African peoples and so on. So, I mean, this becomes a really huge political and theological question. Precisely, where do they fit into Pliny's scheme, basically?
Right. And so that's the section that I want to now get into is how did Judeo-Christianity deal with this? And we've talked about how Columbus was aware and Jonathan Swift having these ideas in his head when he was writing his book. I want to now talk about how the authors of the Bible might have had these ideas in their heads as they were writing scripture and unpacking their theology. They would have heard about these Plinians from their Greek and Roman rulers. It was in the zeitgeist. They were aware of it. Even just the core concept that there might be non-humans out there, that was in their psyche. And so the question being, how did they incorporate or not incorporate those ideas about anthropology into their own Jewish writings? And so let's take it in three major steps. Let's first talk about the Old Testament writers. Now, these ideas would have been in their heads, and how were they responding to those ideas as they wrote and revised their texts and developed their religion?
Well, I'm not really sure I'm in a position to answer that very clearly at all. Look, because simply I'm not sure that I know enough about it. But I do know that from early on, from the writings of even going back to the Pentateuch and the Genesis narrative, people were, to some degree, asking questions that they continued to ask right up until the 16th century and well beyond. For example, Cain goes and builds a city when he is, as it were, banished from the Garden of Eden. Who inhabited that city? Just inhabited by Adam's own children and therefore Cain's siblings. Then there's a text which refers to Cain being banished, and that God puts a mark on his forehead, lest anyone finding him should slay him, I think is what the text says. Now, unless it was going to be another brother, you get the impression that there might be other beings around that would have roughly had it in for Cain. And the questions of this sort were asked about and did lead to speculations. Now, I'm not sure if these speculations are in the biblical text, though, who these strange Nephilim are. These sons of God come down and engage with daughters of men. There did seem to be some thoughts that there were other beings other than the Adamic family. And people, of course, used that to build onto it a kind of non-Adamic humanity or a non-Adamic subhumanity that might have inhabited the world.
The thing that's always really fascinated me about that whole Cain incident and how it's written up, is that the author doesn't care. Like there's almost like there's this assumption that shouldn't be a problem. Like he doesn't
Yeah.
bother to explain why there would be other people, which says to me that maybe, that was just kind of a common idea that was already around, and he didn't feel any need to justify it in any way. But he just says, "Oh, there's this other city," and like
Yeah.
if you were trying to make that narrative work in a modern, that Adamic sense you're talking about, you would
Yeah.
certainly have some explanation, you would think, but it's just not there, and I've always found that fascinating.
Well, I think, can I just add to that, that one of the things that I've found it difficult to get an answer to is not how we should read the Genesis narrative, but how its original readers would have read this
Right.
Genesis narrative. And it's just not right for me to think that when they were reading this narrative, they were asking the sort of questions that post-Enlightenment folks like us ask. So
Right.
they had lots of room, I would imagine, for metaphor, for story, all this kind of a thing. And so sometimes putting a question like this to that text is, in a sense, not the right way to read the text at all, because we're trying to make it
Yeah.
answer a question that the text itself doesn't really ever have in mind. So
Yeah.
in many ways, many of these problems come from later periods looking back to these texts and trying to read their problems into it.
Yeah. Oh,
Right.
I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah.
So let's then move to the second one. We've heard that the ancient writers, the ancient Jewish writers of the Old Testament, were basically, this was not an issue for them, but we should say that they were strongly committed to an Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden scenario,
Yep.
monogenism, this whole idea
Yes.
that humans came from one source. So then there's the second stage I wanted to talk about. What did the New Testament writers, the early Christian church, what did they do with human origins and anthropology and the possibility of other non-humans existing?
Well, I don't find much of that in the New Testament at all, to be
Exactly.
perfectly honest with you. It's
Yeah.
simple as that. Nonetheless, the Apostle Paul, of course, does have these passages where he says, as in Adam all sin, so in Christ all should be made alive. So a lot of people are exegeting that verse, exegete it in such a way that this is a commitment to a single Adam from whom we are all descended. Now, of course, that verse is rarely read, at least in evangelical circles, as literally as it appears. So if we are all in Adam, all sinned, then all humans in Christ will be made alive. And a lot of people don't like the universalism that reading that verse literally would actually mean. But I don't. So therefore, I'm not sure how tied a person has to be to the idea of a unique Adam and so on, simply because of that particular verse. And
Right.
I think that's about the only thing that I can see, other than when you get to the book of Revelation, you see all sorts of other heavenly beings and divine beings and so on. But I don't think that they're exactly in the same category as these sort of monstrous races that we're thinking about. But something is informing that apocalyptic sense of literature, which is fantastical and highly speculative and imaginative and so on. Who knows where they were carving those images from? But I don't see this much in the New Testament. Look,
Right.
maybe I'm wrong. Have you
No,
found it there? No?
nope, I'd agree
Right.
with you entirely. So then let's talk about stage three, as I put it. We've talked about the Old Testament writers. We've talked about the New Testament, the early church. Now let's talk about the whole millennium after that and just before the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries.
Yeah.
Let's hear about this.
Well, I find this extremely interesting. I happened upon this, as I say, in the 16th book of The City of God, and he specifically addresses the question of what about the monstrous races? And the question that he's asking here is simply, are they human or are they not? And so I think what is he going to do here? He's going to elaborate the definition of what it is to be human. Maybe cognitive capacity or capacity to worship or whatever sorts of things you might say. But no, he doesn't do that. He quite simply says they are human if they descended from Adam. If they are not descended from Adam, they're not human. So he doesn't worry about their physical appearance or their intellectual capability or any of the standard things, not even what they look like anatomically. His answer is simply, are they children or descendants of Adam? And if they are, they pass as fully humans. And if they're not, they're not human at all. Now, I don't believe that he ever met a dog-headed, but it's a kind of, should these people exist? This is what I mean, I think, what do you say? I think I actually have the thing here in front of me. Whoever is born anywhere as a human being, this is from Augustine, that is, as a rational moral creature, however strange he may appear to our senses in bodily form, or color, or motion, or utterance, or in any other faculty, let no true believer have any doubt that such an individual is descended from the one man who was first created. Now, in one sense, that's a very strong view about all human races are incorporated in the human family. So even besides the question about so-called monstrous races, color of skin doesn't really matter at all as far as being incorporated in the human family is concerned. So I think that that's an interesting way of a definition of the human as the human's history. If you're descended from X, then you are a human being. Very interesting.
David, can I check something with you? Because the way you put it here, you've made it sound like Augustine was very decided on this matter. The sense I got was that Augustine was taking a very careful, I'm going to say both answers so that nobody can tie me down.
Yeah.
Here's my paraphrase. Basically, they never existed. Or if they did exist, they're not human. Or if they're human, they're descended from Adam.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too and say yes and no in the same breath.
Yeah, that's right. On the other hand, you might say the Christian church doesn't have to declare on whether there are monstrous races or not. There might be. It's a scientific question. It's an empirical question. But they can do a kind of anticipative theology. Should it turn out to be the case that they are there, and should it turn out to be the case of the descendants of Adam, then they're part of the Adamic family. So, he doesn't have to look at one and say, you're in or you're out. If that's your lineage, you're certainly a human being, no matter what you look like. But, I think that this is also steadfastly holding, to monogenism.
Right.
That descent from Adam, a single source, is a critical component, as Augustine sees this, of Christian theology. I haven't read enough on Augustine to know what he thinks about marrying sisters in the early chapters of Genesis, or who occupies Cain's city, or all that sort of a thing. But I think there were people who were beginning to be concerned about issues like that, particularly as the centuries roll on up, into the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. Okay,
so we do want to talk about the main subject of your book, what happened in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. But just for 2 minutes, before we do that, I just want to wrap up our discussion here, because there's a couple interesting points I just want to get you talking about. I just want to emphasize that at this point in history, before we get to the 15th century, the church was fully committed to a worldview in which all humans originated from one human couple, who were Caucasian, by the way, as they would say, because they would have been fully aware dark-skinned people from Africa. Romans had slaves, possibly other people from East Asia, Oriental people from the Far East. But all of those could have originated from ancestors that migrated out of the Middle East, literally walked to those distant lands. But in their mind, the church, centered in Europe, thought that all humans came from a primal pair, Adam and Eve, who were apparently white, alabaster-skinned. And I say that because you look at any of the Renaissance paintings from that period.
Yeah.
They're all Caucasian.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. It'd be interesting to know whether the ancient Hebrews thought Adam was quite as fair-skinned as later Europeans thought they were. But yes, I mean, we've had precisely that image for long enough, though in some ways, though challenged, I think, later. But I mean, the general thrust of what you said, perfectly right. Adamic monogenism was a central component of theology right up through that period of time. But the notion of all peoples of one blood, to use a New Testament term, became a very, very important a sort of key doctrine for those who were opposed to slavery. Of one blood was precisely underscoring the moral significance of monogenism as they could see it. And I mean, of course, as we may get to, there were all sorts of political connections associated with that. It would be very interesting for someone, and maybe it's been done and I just don't know about it, to look through as many examples of early portrayals of Adam in church history to see in what way anatomically Adam was actually presented. Because most of the ones we have, as you say, from the Renaissance or whatever, pre and post Enlightenment, are standard Caucasian, handsome males with beautiful white women as Eve and so on. So, it'd be a great question. Yeah.
Okay. So now we come to that pivotal moment in history. European nations learned how to build ships that could cross the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to lands that were completely unconnected to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And those explorers brought back utterly earth-shattering reports. To call it a paradigm change is really quite an understatement.
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened there at that time.
Well, there are so many things to say about that, Luke. So I'll only scratch the surface with this. I mean, the encounter with the Americas, and there's very sensitive language here. Do you say that Columbus discovered America? Someone said they didn't know it was lost, that it needed to be discovered. Would you describe this as a voyage of discovery? Would you describe this as a voyage of genocide? Would you describe this as a voyage of reconnaissance? I don't know, but whatever. This presented Europe with an enormous intellectual challenge. The first thing is that hitherto, to be a learned person was to be well schooled in the ancient Greeks and Romans. So you went back to Aristotle, you went back to Plato, you go back to these great figures who were not only philosophers, but were natural philosophers and were engaged, of course, in what we would now sort of describe as scientific knowledge. So Pliny gives this taxonomy of all the races. People know, or at least they believe, even from the maps, that all human beings have descended from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. And here you now encounter a whole world with animals and landscapes and human beings that the Greeks never heard of. How are they to be integrated into the standards of knowledge? And in some sense, I think that this is really the beginning of the scientific revolution. We think of Newton and Bacon and Galileo and, all of the astronomers and so on as at the start of the scientific revolution. But here was a case where empirical knowledge could challenge, even from humble seamen, could actually seriously challenge the most learned authors and scholars that the late Middle Ages and early modern period knew about. So, I mean, one of them, for example, writing said, had I Pliny with me and Strabo with me, I would put them to shame and confusion because they had encountered things that those guys never knew. So there was an intellectual challenge. But of course, there was a tremendous religious challenge. Where did these guys come from?
Yeah.
How did they get there? Are they the children of Adam? How did they get across the Atlantic? Was there a land bridge? How did they do this? Are they incorporated within the scope of salvation? What are we going to, maybe they're natural slaves. Can we use them as slaves? So these debates began to mushroom after the 1490s, after Columbus. So I think it was an immense cognitive and scientific and spiritual challenge, the encounter with the New World.
And it needs to be emphasized that they were so gobsmacked because they saw themselves as Europeans as so technologically advanced. They'd built ships that could cross oceans that were completely impassable, and they found these people who, a lot of them didn't even know how to make canoes. They were just so technically, in their eyes, technologically not advanced. And so again, how did they get there?
Well, I think this was a question that really was dominating the thought forms of many Europeans. Now, for those who were within the Christian church, the question then becomes, what do we make of all this? Could there have been a separate center of creation in the Americas somewhere? Maybe there was an American Adam and an American Eve. Did they fall from grace? Maybe these people are not human at all. Very famous debate in Spain about natural slaves and whether it was right for the church to enslave some of these peoples because they were made to be slaves. Should they be preached to? Could they look like humans but have no souls? All of these questions began to exercise European theologians. And what are we going to do with as in Adam all sin? So in Christ should all be made alive. If there was a separate creation across the Atlantic, towards your part of the world, not mine, what were we going to do with you?
and this is the term that comes up a lot in this part of the scholarly discussion is polygenism as opposed to monogenism.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. And, I think that when I was writing about polygenism, which really means multiple origins, when I was writing on this, I think I could find little hints of it sort of earlier in church history. But it's one of those things, it's kind of a historiographical problem. When you start looking for a precursor to something, you begin assuming that person, if they hinted something, was contributing to an idea that had not even entered the scene yet. And you construct a kind of genealogy that, may be more a product of later thinking than what was actually there at the time. So I date a lot of this from 1655. And in 1655, Isaac La Pereire wrote this book about pre-Adamites. And when he was doing this, he's interpreted in many different ways. One of them is he's interpreted as a deep skeptic who wants to undermine Scripture. Others that he is deeply conservative and wants to preserve the integrity of Scripture by saying that the story of Adam is only the story of the Jewish race, that Caucasians and others come from a line of humanity that's non-Adamic. So his reading of Scripture is constrained by several things. It's constrained, first of all, by what he thinks are some tensions in exegeting, particularly Paul's epistle to the Romans. Until law was in the world, sin was in the world. And he thinks, where was that sin? There must have been some other people prior to the Adamic law. At this stage, more and more information was beginning to be accumulated on other genealogies from the Babylonians, for example. And when you totted up their genealogies, they were a lot longer than what became, the 4004 BC from Christianity. What are you going to do with these? Then, of course, thirdly, he was well aware by 1650s of these voyages of exploration. So these three pressure points, internal theology, lengthy chronologies from other peoples and nations, and direct encounter with races that were unknown to Europe, how do you make the Bible integrate with those? And his solution was multiple creations. There were earlier creations, there were co-Adamite creations at the same time in different parts of the earth. And the one that we have is a Jewish story about the Jewish race that goes back to Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. And this was intended in some ways to liberate the Bible's chronology from the pressures that are coming from these other sources. So you either see him as skeptical about Scripture or trying to save Scripture by saying, yeah, that 4004 genealogy, perfectly good for Adam, but it's no good for the Babylonians,
Right.
no for the Americans and so on.
Is he so hard to pin down in part because he's such a complex individual? By that I mean, as I understand it, he was a Jew, but he was a Jew from Portugal, a Portuguese Jew, but originally from Bordeaux, and he's got Calvinist leanings.
Correct. In fact, he's supposed to have converted to Calvinism, and this is what got him arrested. He was traveling in what you would say modern day Belgium, and the papal authorities, of course, didn't like this talk about multiple creations and polygenism one little bit, so they arrested him and took him to Rome. And the Pope then at the time, I think it was Pope Urban, thought he was kind of an entertaining character to have around the court. This guy would be, like a court jester or something like that. So he really liked him, but he put him under house arrest, and he then constructed something that he's going to rescind all his beliefs and so on. But clever devil that he was, he constructed that in such a way that he never actually denied polygenism. But they treated him pretty well. But I think that in the generation that followed, there was treatise after treatise after treatise published to refute Perer's polygenism, even though the number of people who supported it, you could probably count on about one hand, which shows how much the church was spooked by this guy from a Jewish background. And of course, people said, well, he's from a Jewish background. That's why he's saying Adam is Jewish. It's a kind of pro-Semitic document. And in some ways it might well have been, but he really terrified theologians in the 16th century over this, on the 17th century, over this new theory that he put forward.
So, David, was it Isaac Laperriere or later people who read his book who came up with this idea that Hebrew was the first human language and it's best preserved in Chinese? And the reason they said that is because China has always been so closed to the rest of the world, and so their language was unmarred by any other human language, and so they were trying to dig out the original Hebrew language out of the Chinese?
Well, that's absolutely right, because the origin of humans, of course, is intimately connected with the origins of language. And you can either take the kind of Babel story literally, or you can try to empirically work on the history of language. So what was Adam's language was a really important question right up through the 17th century. And in fact, Umberto Eco, who wrote that famous book, that novel about Foucault's pendulum and a variety of things, he wrote a whole book on the search for Adam's language. And all sorts of groups, of course, felt that their language really was Adam's language. In fact, there is an interesting project that was carried out where someone said Irish was Adam's original language. So, I'm still slightly skeptical about that.
I was going to say King James English. Isn't King James English
exactly?
What Adam spoke?
And whenever Adam spoke, he numbered all the sentences the way the Apostle Paul did.
Yeah.
So there actually then did become a kind of application of monogenism and polygenism as a way of studying language. Did language emerge in very different places across the face of the earth? And the whole set of writings coming right down into the 19th century, where very, very celebrated linguists were working on the question of whether all human languages had diverged from a single source, or whether it emerged in a kind of polyphyletic way in different places and in different locations across the face of the earth. And I think to some degree that's still really an important issue, how much had original languages diverged before modern languages really began to develop. So you're quite right. The question of linguistic origins was actually central right up through. I mean, interestingly enough, even in Charles Darwin's writings, the example that he uses of evolutionary development on a tree-like fashion is the evolution of language. It's dispersal out from an original center. So yes, you're quite right. I think that became a very, very important question.
To help the listeners maybe get a mental image of the period of history that we've been talking about, I mean, we have been bouncing around a lot, but this period in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries when they were finding these other peoples and wondering, are they really, do they have souls, etc. The 1986 blockbuster movie, The Mission, and there they had Portuguese mercenaries, the Jesuit priests. And oh, by the way, beautiful soundtrack. The movie is just worth watching just for the scenery and the soundtrack alone, although it's a heartbreaking movie too.
Yeah.
But my question is this, where the one priest was trying to show these Paraguayan people singing, I forget if it was Ave Maria or Te Deum or some Catholic hymn, and they sang it so beautifully, and the mercenaries, the Portuguese mercenaries, and the other priests just dismissed it, saying they're just parrots. They've just been taught to whistle tunes that they heard people sing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that whole missionary encounter, as well as the voyages of exploration, raised questions about, as you say, whether they're just parroting something or whether there's something deeper. But as I was saying, there was this famous debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda. Both were Jesuits. One had been a missionary in South America, and the question was, were these people slaves? And it was a scientific question because, ironically, if you wanted to have a literal Adam as the progenitor of the human race, you also had to be an evolutionist, because you had to believe in some form of natural evolution that would bring about different color of skin, different type of hair, different type of profile, and so on. And so how were these questions being answered? And typically the answer was evolution through the climate. Climate brought about these changes. So in one sense, you had to be an evolutionist if you wanted to hold on to a literal Adam. If you didn't want to hold on to a literal Adam, then you could be a creationist much more easily, because God made these creatures different races with different atoms for each of them. So, questions about language, questions about psychology, questions about what it is to be human, questions about how anatomies transform over time, all of these were folded into the question about Adam and Adamic successors.
So I'd like to take what we've just been saying and apply this to the whole mini-series of episodes that we've been pulling together. I brought you here to tell us about how the church responded to scientific discoveries in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, whole new peoples, and how that completely upended their whole theology. And so now today we have discoveries again of whole other organisms that we are related to. Neanderthals and Denisovans and a long list of other ones as well. And so do you see a resonance here? Is there something that we can take from the story that you've been telling us about and apply it to today's discoveries, or at least see the similarities and differences between what we're finding today of these hominid discoveries?
Yeah, I think there are. And I think it's different for different communities. I mean, the whole question about Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and things of this sort. Back in the early 20th century, these questions with fossil remains being excavated in China and Heidelberg and the Spy Valley and things of that sort raised questions for Christians who were practicing scientists about what was the significance of this spiritually for the human race. And a very interesting case was a guy called Ambrose Fleming. Ambrose Fleming was a very distinguished engineer. In fact, I think he was being nominated for a Nobel Prize at some point. But he wanted to make the argument that the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, who were, I think, the first Homo sapiens in Europe, that there was not just a quantitative, but there was a qualitative difference. And he wanted to say that from Cro-Magnons on, the human race now had for the first time a human soul, that these other creatures were not human in anything like the sort of biblical sense. So he wanted to make an argument, and I think that there are some who still hold this today, that the Adamic story is the story of those who were ensouled, if I can put it that way, with a capacity for worship, and that's what distinguishes them from other races or other pre-hominids and so on. In the 20th century and on up to the present day, I think it does raise the question of what it is essentially to be human. Are there any lines that can be drawn between humans and pre-humans? If there are, what would those lines look like? Would it be anything anatomical? Would it be anything spiritual? Would it be anything psychological? What would it be? And this led in the mid-20th century to a reinvention of the pre-Adamite theory. Not so much that there were different centers of creation, but that there were many near-human, pre-Adamic organisms who might have looked like Adam, might have been as bright as Adam intellectually, but did not possess anything of the sense of a divine presence that the Adamic race had. So it's now integrated less into a creationist kind of worldview, but more into an evolutionary one, so that you do acknowledge pre-hominids, and then whenever you get to Cro-Magnons or whenever you get to Adam, then it's modern humans. But I think even for anthropology more generally, are there any clear-cut boundaries between human species and other species, particularly other species of hominid? We now hear about interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovians, and then we hear about Homo floresiensis and a whole range of these emerging, but only one Homo sapiens seems to win out. And I suppose the question is, was it just luck that happened?
Well,
was it just adaptation? you know.
That's a
Sorry, Scott.
fascinating question I was going to ask. And I know creationists will bring this up as a counter, I'm not saying it in that sense to
Yeah.
evolution, but it is interesting that we are the only hominids
Hmm.
that made it, that all these
Yeah.
subspecies or whatever are gone. And in many other areas of, I would think, correct me if I'm wrong, Luke, but in other areas of biology, like, the great apes and things like that,
Hmm.
do you see that same disappearance of pre-species? I suppose maybe you do. I don't know. It's just interesting to me why none of these
Hmm.
other, call them whatever you want to call them, species or whatever, they made it. Did we kill them all, or did you know?
I mean, there are loads of theories around that bottleneck and so on. I mean, one that seems to come up a great deal is that changed weather conditions with climate change in the past and
Right.
so on, that any creature that had the capacity to have a flexible enough mindset to adapt to those
Mm.
circumstances, they wouldn't have to kill the others off. Climate did it for them, basically.
Right.
And
Right.
but I mean, and then that puts an awful lot into the cognitive dimensions of human beings, where
Right.
they're able to perceive future threats, contemporary threats, think about ways of mitigating these, and so on. But, you know, where does human dignity reside?
Mm.
What is it about humans that give the human species dignity and separate humans from the rest of the other creatures? Many people say that there shouldn't be such a line
Right.
drawn, that it's just a mistake to think that way. Others think no, and this goes back well into the early church, about humans seem to be the creature that are endowed with divine image. They have the image of God in the way in which other creatures. But interestingly, you might find this interesting, Luke, about this little book that I did. I got an interesting review about this book, and which I was very pleased about. But as this author came to the end of the book, he said something that I was quite shocked at initially. He said, the question of pre-Adamites and Adamites is maybe more relevant now in the 21st century than it's ever been before. And I thought, well, not many people think much about Adam or pre-Adamites, apart from the guys I've been writing about, excavating them out of history. And then he said, we are on the verge of post-Adamic humanity, because human capability of intervening in our genetic composition, a kind of neo-eugenics or whatever, maybe there will be a species that emerges that goes beyond what we are, and thinking about boundaries and what it is to be human, especially when there's now talk about people calling for a bill of post-human rights, not
Mm-hmm.
just human rights, never mind pre-human rights. Struck me that there maybe is still something here about tying the Adamic story in one way or another to what it essentially is to be a human being. So, I might be more relevant than I ever thought I was going to be.
I think you are. Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, we're getting short on time, and there's so much that we could have said. David, is there anything more that you wanted to say that we have not gotten into yet?
Yeah, I think there is one thing, Luke, and it's an anecdote, but it shows me about the persistence of these ideas. So one afternoon, when I had almost finished writing the book, and I was sitting at my computer, and I thought, there's a website that connects you to, I don't know how many hundreds, used bookstores. And I got into this, ABE Books, I think it is,
Mm.
and in I went, and I typed in the word pre-Adam or pre-Adamism. Now, I'm sitting here thinking, I've almost finished a book, and there will be no book that I don't know about on pre-Adamites. And that's something you should never say, that's for sure. So the search engine trundled around, and it spat out about 10 books that I'd never heard of
Mm.
dealing with pre-Adamic humanity, right? So, and they were all published in, the early 2000s. So I mean, this wasn't as if I was finding something for the 16th century or something, the early 2000s. And so I tapped into these, and I thought, I've got to read these. They're all talking about pre-Adamic humanity and pre-Adamism and race and all this sort of a thing. And it turned out that they were all from a single bookstore in, I think it was in Missouri. And they were connected with a group called the kingdom identity movement.
Oh, right.
So well, maybe I'm striking some chord here. They were nine, they weren't really books. They were pamphlets that were probably run off on an old-fashioned, what were they, Gestetners or something, that you used to run these things off. And they were revisiting the most racist types of pre-Adamite literature to say that contemporary African Americans were not human, were not of the Adamic race, that intermarriage was, miscegenation was completely anti-Christian, anti-biblical, and so on. And I thought to myself, it really turned out to be a very, very far-right group republishing many of these works that I thought were just gathering dust on shelves. Historians like finding books that are dusty because we'll find something new. But this was alive and well and was being mobilized for far-right, deeply racist white nationalism. And I said to my wife, Frances, I said, do you think I'm safe ordering these? Maybe the CIA will be on my case before too long. But I ordered up some of them, and really, I have to say, they were absolutely ghastly. They were bilious. Now, the final bit of my story, Luke, and I'm talking much too much, but hey, I'm Irish,
and you're the guest.
So whenever I came to write about this in the book, it raised a very difficult historical question for me about what language I should use to describe these works. Should I, as a historian, be passing moral judgments on these people? Or should I, as a historian, be trying to understand people who hold a worldview that's a million miles from me? So when I wrote it first time, I talked about in a disgraceful pamphlet or in a sickening account, so-and-so would say this. And I gave the manuscript to a friend of mine who's a dramatist, and he came back and said, look, take all those adjectives out. He said, the most horrible thing I ever read about the Holocaust was one that just described it in cold, clinical detail. So this raises the question about how much of a moral philosopher does a historian have to be to write works like racism and pre-Adamitism and so on. So that's my anecdote, and it might tie in with certain versions of white nationalism now among us.
Right. Yeah. I recognize that when you said the kingdom identity, I went, oh, those people, because aren't they the ones that think they see themselves as the new Israel?
Absolutely.
The original Israel, they made the big mistake and they're out of the picture. And now God has chosen America as the new Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely so. Very scary.
The Dominionists is another group that are similar. I'm not saying they're the same, but Rush Dooney being the intellectual leader of that movement. And they become increasingly popular, especially in certain states, particularly Idaho, I believe, is a real enclave.
That's good.
David, any sequels to Adam's Ancestors?
No, I just brought out pretty big book on the history of ideas about climate from the ancient world to last week. And I think that has exhausted me for a while. So I'll just stick with reading novels now that I'm retired.
Right. Well, I had an idea for you. You wrote about the 16th and 17th century where they found new people on other continents. And now we're talking about hominids, finding new people from a different time, not just a different geography. And then maybe your sequel could be looking at, the Hollywood-fueled fantasies of life on other planets that are not just, geographically separated, but they're astronomically separated. Actually, that'll raise a few more questions when we find those guys.
Well, that's absolutely right. And quite interestingly, there were people writing about this. Could there be life on other planets? And those who said yes said, it's no more difficult for the redemption of Christ to reach those on other planets than it was to reach the poor pre-Adamites. So distance in time and distance in space are actually closely connected.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. This has been so enjoyable. You're a wonderful speaker, and it was great to have you on.
Well, look, thanks for the invitation. I've talked, of course, too much, but
not at all.
I love these discussions, and it's been great fun to speak with both of you.
Well, it's been so educational for me and so enjoyable. I just really appreciate being able to be participate.
Well, let's
So
hope we can do this face to face sometime. That'll be even better.
that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
And by the way, as an aside, ABE Books is located on Vancouver Island.
There you go. You go down there and look for these
Yeah,
PM books.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, David. We'll talk
Thank you.
again.
A great
Okay.
pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Take care.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
We'll see
Bye
you
now.
later.
Bye.
All the best. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.